Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Joanne Briggs. I am the Vice President of the Public Relations Association of Trinidad and Tobago, and welcome to PRATT. Now, PRATT is our platform for public relation practitioners as well as curious folks to discuss, topics that may affect our industry. So for those who are not familiar with this space, just to give you an idea of who we are, the Public Relations Association of Trinidad and Tobago represents public relation practitioners of course, in the country. It was established in 1972. You see how long we have been here, right? Aimed at elevating the standard of the PR practice locally and providing support for professionals who share common goals and experiences. So, this is definitely the platform by which we can discuss certain things. All right, for this week, well, not for this week, for this month, because we do PRATT ever so often, like every other month. This one, we are talking about gender inclusion in the workplace. Our guest is Dr. Angelique Nixon, who is Bahamas born, but Trinidad based. She's a writer, artist, and scholar activist. Her research and creative work have been published widely. She is the author of 2 books, one poetry and an art collection titled Saltwater Healing, and the scholarly award-winning book titled Resisting Paradise, Tourism, Diaspora, and Sexuality in Caribbean Culture. Dr. Nixon is a lecturer at the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. That's where I'm from. I'm also a student there. She's also a director on the working board of CAISO, Sex and Gender Justice in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, today's theme is rather interesting for me because I am reflecting on my days as a journalist. For those who don't know, yeah, I used to work on the other side. And there was one particular story that I was covering that dealt with one of the laws that related to same-sex relationships. And in the case, I went out and was speaking to some, to couples. And in this one particular case, this same-sex couple, one worked in the private sector, one worked in a state organization. And they were talking about the issues, the challenges they faced within their work environment, although they were professional, high up management, and they were able to perform and deliver on their work mandates. But at the same time, what their sexual preference was still an issue. Now, that's what brought it back to me, because we know there's a lot of work to be done. And Dr. Nixon is just going to share some ideas as to, not to say how we can change, but just widen the discussion a little bit so people can be aware. So I toss it over to Dr. Nixon. Good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Joanne, for that really great introduction, and thank you to the Public Relations Association of Trinidad and Tobago for inviting me to offer this discussion. And when you invited me, I wanted to be clear about what are the things we could talk about today. And so I am going to share my screen and then dive all the way in. But thanks to everyone who has joined us on Facebook and watching live. And I am going to share my screen. And so how I'm going to frame today is thinking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And we're going to talk about gender equality and justice and LGBTI plus communities. Okay, and so we're going to go through a lot of information, and I just ask everyone, reserve your questions. And of course, you can put that in the Facebook chat, to share some of those questions, and we will have those at the end. So I'm going to move on quickly. So first we have to think about, when we talk about gender equality, I want us to be really clear about what gender equality means. And we see these terms a lot. So often, gender equality also includes the questions and discussions around equity. And generally, yes, we're talking about the empowerment of women, women's rights, human rights generally, and of course, LGBTI rights when we talk about gender equality and gender justice. And so I wanted to start off with this really powerful quote by Kofi Annan. There is no tool for development more effective than the empowerment of women. So when we think about development, when we think about justice in our societies and of course in our country and indeed the region, we are thinking about this from the perspective of empowerment. We're thinking about it from the perspective of rights, and human rights, of course, include women's rights and include LGBTI rights, along with many other ways that we can think about rights. And so I wanted to frame our conversation as we get into these terms and think through them, and when we are talking about the workplace and when we're talking about what do we mean by inclusion. So I want to just share some global statistics from UN Women around how we discuss and think about gender equality. There's been a lot of work and a lot of advocacy, activism, and movement building, women's movements, especially in our region, dealing with all of these issues. But this is a global perspective on where we are with gender equality. So we're not going to talk about all of these, but I just wanted to have it be our frame as we think through where do we still see gender inequalities? And we certainly see it in all of these major spaces: politics, wages, senior management, and those all have to do with business and all have to do when we think about workplaces. Of course, we can think about gender inequality, and for our region, in particular, violence against women and gender-based violence remain a serious and pressing concern. And in fact, in Trinidad and Tobago, we know the global statistics of 1 out of 3 women experiencing physical or sexual violence, mostly by an intimate partner in her lifetime, remain, and those have been affirmed by 2 recent studies, the National Women's Health Survey, as well as a prevalence study on gender-based violence just conducted in 2017 and 2018, respectively. So we can think about the questions of gender equality in all these different areas of our lives. And of course, this includes the workplace. And this continues. You can see other areas: education, literacy, media, access to clean water, maternal deaths. These are generally the kind of areas we want to think about when we talk about gender equality, and how they, of course, then affect us in our workplaces and our households. These are all connected. We can't separate them. And so I also wanted to unpack some of the terms that we are going to use. We've already started with equality, and we've also added in equity, and I want to add in some other words, and justice, of course, which I said we would also think about today. And you can just see in these diagrams, these illustrations, just to give us a sense really quickly. So equality is about leveling the playing field, making sure everybody has the same access. But you can see that and when we talk about equity and justice, we're talking about thinking about historical marginalizations, the disadvantages that groups of people based on identity, based on position, based on class, race, sexuality, gender, ability, religion, and so on, have experienced inequalities and marginalizations. And so that's why I wanted to frame our conversation thinking about the questions of equality and equity. And that's why often you'll see questions of gender equality and gender justice, including the language and saying, yes, we're thinking about equity. And what does that mean? And so we can see that equality assumes that everyone should benefit from the same kind of support, and that's equal treatment. Yes, of course, equality is our goal, always. But equity is making sure that everyone gets the support that they need, right? And that helps to produce, and thinking about how do we produce equity, because we want equality, but we have to make sure that everyone gets the support that they need. And then justice is really thinking about how do we address the inequalities, the causes of those inequalities, and removing systemic barriers or structural barriers from that access, having equal and equitable and just access for all. And then, of course, liberation is removing the barriers altogether. And these are different ways that these terms have been defined and used, and we see them in the conversations about diversity and inclusion. And to even break that down further, right, just to be clear, we see these definitions, and sometimes the equality definition will say we want to think about equity. And sometimes equality can get really caught up in numbers, and that's why the concept of equity is not based on numerical equivalences, but it acknowledges that all human beings have the right to an enabling environment in which to develop their fullest potential. So equality refers to the right of everyone, all sexes, classes, abilities, gender identities, etc., to have the same opportunities for achievement of important goals in society: education, employment, and income. And then we add equity in there to acknowledge that we need to ensure an enabling environment. And this is really important when we talk about the workplace. Professor Eugene Barreto defines gender justice as a societal condition in which there are no asymmetries of access to or allocation of status, power, and material resources in a society, or in the control over and capacity to benefit from these resources. Yes? And so this is really acknowledging that if we want to get to a place of gender justice, right? So we're moving gender equality, yes, but to gender justice, we want to make sure that there are no barriers. There are no systems in place that prevent access and allocation of status, power, and material resources in our society, and how we benefit, who controls and how we benefit from those resources. And Professor Barreto says, in a gender system characterized by gender justice, there will be no hierarchies of gender identities or the meanings society gives to masculinity and femininity. So just reflecting a little bit on what we mean by gender justice is that we want there to be a real, there are no positions based on one's status that is going to put someone in a superior position over someone else. And often sometimes advantages and disadvantages are sometimes invisible, or we don't quite see them. And that's when we talk about and think about the differences around pay equity, the wage gap, things that have been just sort of entrenched in our systems. We don't even question and think about it. And so when we're talking about gender justice, we're moving towards and working towards societies where these things are not that are not unequal. We are moving and wanting and working towards fighting against those inequalities, and that's why gender justice and a framework of gender justice is so important when we're talking about diversity and inclusion in all of our spaces, but in particular for our discussion today when we're talking about the workplace. So I want to also ensure that when we talk about gender, that we're not thinking about gender as separate from all of our other identities. So as we think about gender inequalities, we have to also think about how those are impacted by racism, class, homophobia, transphobia, discrimination against disabilities, or ableism, and other issues. And so we use this term a lot in our work when we have an analysis of how gender works in relationship to other aspects of identity, which can then impact how people are treated. And so I've have a number of illustrations here to bring this point home as we think about intersectionality and power, and referencing here the Black theorist, Black feminist, poet, activist, and writer Audre Lorde, who says there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And so when we talk about our experiences in the workplace, in society, and how treatment happens, I don't show up only as a woman. I'm also a Black woman. I am a light-skinned woman. I come from poor and working class families. And I am now a lecturer at a university, and I have socio and economic mobility. And so I have to think about and talk about my experience. I'm also a same-sex loving woman. And so all of these things about me matter. I'm a migrant, right? And so, we have to think about how all of these markers of identity impact how we think and talk about gender and sexuality. And so I want to affirm that as we think through and talk about inclusion and diversity, we don't want to have, as Audre Lorde would say, we don't want a hierarchy of oppressions, but rather intersectionality helps us to think about how these things are interlocking and how they impact and affect each other, and acknowledging the different positions and locations with which we are in, how we are treated, how we operate, and how people might also see us. And so as we think about these terms and think about this framework of intersectionality, I want us to kind of hold that as we then talk about and understand and think about this big question of human rights in the workplace. So there are a number of international conventions that we ascribe to and that we think through, and that in fact Trinidad and Tobago, as much of many other countries, are signed on to or in an agreement with. We think about the International Bill of Human Rights through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which then has been codified in our International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. And so, when we talk about rights, sometimes it can feel like, oh, I'm not quite sure what we're getting at. But we certainly are guided by these international covenants, which we have signed on to many countries around the world. And also we are also guided by the ILO's Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, the International Labor Organization. And so I wanted to highlight these as we're thinking about the workplace. Freedom of association and effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining, elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, effective abolition of child labor, and elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. So we have these conventions and understandings of human rights and what we mean by the fundamental principles and rights at work. And these all will frame our conversation today as we then think more specifically about gender, equality and justice, and LGBTI plus communities engaged in work. So when we say discrimination in the workplace, what are we talking about? So it can take place, of course, when an employer discriminates against an employee in relationship to any work-related decisions, from hiring and firing, promotions, and availability of benefits. And there are guiding principles around how we understand and think about discrimination. So you can see here, the actions of business enterprises can affect people's enjoyment of their human rights, either positively or negatively. Indeed, experience shows that enterprises can and do infringe human rights where they are not paying sufficient attention to this risk. So employers and workplaces have an obligation to then think about what is happening in the workplace. Further, the guiding principles say, and I quote, enterprises can affect the human rights of their employees and contract workers, their customers, workers in their supply chains, communities around their operations, and end users of their products or services. They can have an impact, directly or indirectly, on virtually the entire spectrum of internationally recognized human rights. And this is why we're having this conversation today, because discrimination in the workplace indeed happens. And we want to think about how we can prevent that, and the things that for all of you and involved in whatever organization and business that you are a part of, thinking about how you can work to end discrimination in the workplace. Of course, it means that we have to recognize that it is happening. And so I want to just, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to just make sure folks have working definitions for your group and understanding when we talk about sex and gender and sexuality and sexual orientation, what we mean. And so in sexuality studies, we talk about sex. Of course, we generally refer to it as the physical differences between male and female bodies. These are often referred to as biological differences. And they can include reproductive system and other biological characteristics. But sex is most commonly divided into the categories of male and female. But biological sex is much more diverse. And you can see that with the fact that almost 2% of the world's population are born intersex. That means that they are born with physical and biological sex characteristics that may not fit the typical definitions of male or female. And they may appear at birth or later in life. often at puberty, intersex people can have any sexual orientation and gender identity. And so it's important, we think about sex as being binary. There are only two, but that's not the case. Sex is complicated. And so just affirming that when we say LGBTI, intersex is I, and what we mean by intersex. And gender. Gender is a term that we've used to refer in gender studies and in sexuality studies to talk about the ways that we have expectations and roles and opportunities for people based on what we perceive as biological sex, whether we are identified at birth as male or female, and how we are raised then and socially constructed to become men and women. It's often what we talk about as being masculine or feminine, but these are socially constructed and they vary across cultures and ethnicities in terms of how we define masculinity and femininity. And we know that, of course, in our own cultural context and how we talk about Caribbean masculinities and femininities. Now, understandings of gender have shifted, but unequal power relations in terms of gender still prevail. For example, women are expected to take greater responsibility for childcare and housework in many societies, and we describe this as a gendered division of labor. Sexual orientation refers to a person's physical, romantic, and/or emotional attraction towards other people. Everyone has a sexual orientation. It's a part of our identity. It's a range of behaviors and attractions that's been described in various cultures throughout the world in different kinds of ways. Many cultures have different identity labels to describe people who express these attractions. And it's important to know that sexual orientation is different from gender identity. Often they get conflated. And so I want to be clear about that when we define LGBTI plus what we mean. And it is important to not make assumptions about people's sexual orientation. And we know that so many times that people can experience discrimination on the basis of both gender identity and sexual orientation, or even assumptions. So I use the term LGBTIQ plus communities to, really highlight the fact that LGBTI plus folks are not all the same. Often we'll see LGBTI community, and I'm also guilty of this because sometimes it's easier to describe a community, but we are in fact communities. And it's important to know that LGBT plus persons living in Trinidad and Tobago, like the rest of the world, are diverse and a part of many other communities across different racial and ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic status, religion, political affiliations, etc., etc., right? And when we say LGBTIQ+, that acronym, it includes both sexual and gender minorities, or what I like to say is diverse sexualities and diverse genders. So of course there's a way that we describe sexual orientation: lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, asexual, same-sex loving, same-gender loving. That is describing how someone might identify or describe their sexual orientation, who they are attracted to, however that is. Gender identity is how someone identifies their gender. So someone can identify their gender as what I've been assigned at birth. I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as a woman. You'll see in some of the LGBT studies and sexuality studies that folks use the language of cisgender. I am cisgender because I identify with what I was assigned at birth. But someone who is transgender, is someone who does not identify with how they were assigned at birth, and so therefore they might describe themselves as transgender. We also have people who describe themselves as gender nonconforming. They don't ascribe to either of the binary. They're outside of the binary system, and sometimes would describe themselves as gender non-binary. Gender identity is also a place where someone might describe themselves as gender queer, among many other things. And so it's important. These are very complicated and we don't have time to break them all down. So just to say, I want folks to understand that the LGBTIQ plus is diverse and complicated. And in Trinidad and Tobago, there are several LGBTI organizations that work on various issues. And in fact, several have come together to work in a coalition called the Alliance for Justice and Diversity. We've worked on a project called the Sexual Culture of Justice that recently ended, as well as a policy agenda, which I will share with you all in a few minutes. I wanted to talk for a little bit about, here in Trinidad and Tobago, what's happening in terms of discrimination protection. So many of you might know that the Equal Opportunity Act of 2000 promotes equality of opportunity between persons of different status, sex, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, marital status, or disability are clearly marked. This really important piece of legislation prohibits discrimination in relation to employment, education, the provision of goods and services, and the provision of accommodation or housing. However, the definition of sex in the Act states does not include sexual orientation. So you have a piece of legislation that is supposed to be anti-discrimination, that actively discriminates against people based on sexual orientation. And so folks who experience discrimination in the workplace, among other places, cannot seek redress through the Equal Opportunity Act. Now, the Equal Opportunity Commission is charged by law, of course, to recommend updates and changes. And so since 2008, folks have been able to access the Equal Opportunity Commission to seek redress. But and you can do that in many ways, whether you're seeking work or at work in a private business or public sector, and you have a number of issues, you can lodge a complaint. However, not all people can access these the EOC, and one of the things that we've identified is that it's not only sexual orientation that's explicitly excluded, but other factors such as age or even health conditions prevent people from being able to access this protection. And so the issue here is that folks can be legally discriminated against in terms of employment and other spaces, but I want to highlight employment today. And what we have done and what folks have been advocating for since 2011, CAISO, Sex and Gender Justice in particular, been advocating for change in this act. And through this project that we worked on together for a number of years, several organizations, along with the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, we worked on a very ambitious project, many activities over the course of 4 years. And what we did was that we supported a long-standing campaign, the Add All 3 campaign that CAISO led initially as a coalition with many organizations. And so the Add All 3 campaign continues. We relaunched an expanded version in 2018 to include LGBTI status. We focus on sexual orientation for a number of years, but then we wanted to recognize that LGBTI status gives us more protection for sexual orientation as well as gender identity. And so this has been a long-standing campaign, and I just want to share a little bit more about what has happened with this campaign. And I want to encourage, we'll share a link where you can see some of the ads. We launched radio ads that went across 8 radio stations in 2020, and we also have an animation and graphics, and you can find these on this link. And so maybe Joanne, if you can share that on Facebook so folks can find more information about the Add All 3 campaign.
Yeah, we will.
Why we are calling for that. I wanted to share the animation, but I'm mindful of time. And so, oops, I've gone too far. Yes. So what we did over the past few years is we recruited champions of the Add All 3. We put out radio ads and an animation just to generate public awareness about this really important piece of legislation that we are calling for amendments. And in fact, the Equal Opportunity Commission has supported these amendments since 2011, along with every single human rights review that Trinidad and Tobago has undergone at the United Nations, as well as the Organization of American States since 2000. This piece of legislation has been identified as something that is discriminatory and violates people's human rights. So I just want to share, I'm going to go through this, that after the judgment in 2018, which essentially decriminalized the criminalization of same-sex sex acts between adults, consenting adults, and so on, the High Court ruled that sex between consenting adults of the same sex was no longer against the law and cannot be made illegal. And so one of the things that we did as organizations doing public awareness around the judgment, we created these infographics so people could be very aware of what we needed to know and why and why this ruling was so important, and how if there were any fears about why we needed that particular, the Sexual Offenses Act and those particular sections, we affirmed that there were other legislation that protect, for example, children and issues of non-consensual sex acts. Also, it was really important for us to share with the public back in 2018 that, the government appealed this decision, and it is now at appeal at the Privy Council, and this matter is still years later. We're in 2021. We still don't know what's happened with this appeal yet, and we are still waiting. But in 2018, after 2018, what has happened is that there's been a really urgent need for LGBTI protection, especially in terms of employment and housing and access to goods and services, because a number of LGBTI folks experienced different forms of discrimination, from family violence to public harassment, being kicked out of their homes, and losing jobs. And really the issue remains since 2018 that LGBTI people do not have access to protection under the Equal Opportunity Act, and that would not be changed until this appeal went through. And so this issue, even though decriminalization happened, the issue remains that people don't have protection in the workplace on the basis of being LGBTI plus. And so I want to share a little bit about, this is the kind of work that we've been doing, the policy agenda. You will see that the policy agenda, and you can find this also on the portal here, shares a number of different concerns and issues. We created this across 7 organizations through several meetings and town halls with different community members around these issues, and you can see that outlawing discrimination in employment, housing, insurance, and other services remain an important part of the policy agenda, and what organizations and different groups have been calling for around advocacy. And so as I'm wrapping up soon, I wanted to share that we've been working on multiple fronts in terms of the Sexual Culture of Justice Project and how it supported the work of the Alliance for Justice and Diversity and several organizations and LGBTI organizations who are really thinking through this question of discrimination. How do we fight against it? And so while the Add All 3 campaign is one place, we're calling for legislative change, calling on the government to make those amendments, supporting what the Equal Opportunity Commission has long called for, as well as human rights conventions and organizations and reviews. We've also created a policy agenda for government and policy makers and stakeholders to know what are the issues facing LGBTI plus people living in Trinidad and Tobago. And then we also did this, and I think that this should interest the Public Relations Association, depending on your areas of work. But what CAISO did was we developed a model LGBTI workplace policy for Trinidad and Tobago, hoping to work with the private sector. And some of you might know that Scotiabank just recently announced its same-sex that same-sex couples would be able to receive benefits as employees of Scotiabank. Congratulations to Scotiabank for that huge work. And we also know that many organizations support having an inclusive and a really focused LGBTI plus workplace policy. And so I wanted to pull here from we are about to launch this officially in the next month or two, but we've been working closely with the Equal Opportunity Commission and all of the LGBTI organizations, as well as having consultants help us create this policy. And I'm showing here some quotes from Colin Robinson, the founder of CAISO, who recently passed. I want to honor and acknowledge his work on this project we called Finding an Equal Place at Work. And this came out of all of the years of working on policy agendas and also hearing and doing work and the experiences of folks, LGBTI people living in Trinidad and Tobago, and how they experience discrimination. And so here you can see, I'm just going to share a little bit here. You can read along with me, but this is from Colin Robinson, a quote from the foreword that accompanies our workplace policy that we'll be launching very soon. Quote, one of the assets of doing business in Trinidad and Tobago is the diversity of our workforce. It's no secret from the management literature that workplaces that encourage and accommodate worker diversity see the returns in their bottom line. Researchers have also begun to document the costs to national economies of anti-LGBTI discrimination, not to mention the economic and psychological harms to the workers themselves and their families. Ensuring LGBTI plus people find an equal place at work is in the interest not just of those workers, but many others. So this is our, kind of pitch for why we want to advance and encourage businesses and private sector in particular to take up a workplace policy. And we hope that that will encourage and push government and, really push ministries to think about their own diversity and inclusion policies in the workplace. Colin goes on to say, besides being good business, making Trinidad and Tobago's workplaces equal is also an ethical question for many, a simple matter of fairness. Some employers and associations seek to champion workplace equality in their fields. Every union in Trinidad and Tobago may have LGBTI plus members, but most are unaware of their concerns or the measures they could be negotiating for in collective agreements. So both employers and unions leave value on the table. Again, this workplace policy is really thinking about how do we foster inclusion, diversity, how do we make that possible, and how do we ensure, and this workplace policy offers tools for employers, and in particular for folks in PR, in public relations, as well as in human resources, you have definitions, you have clear places to help understand and be sensitive to the needs of LGBTI plus employees and workers. And this also then extends to clients, right? And people who are using your businesses and organizations and who seek services. And so I continue from Colin Robinson, quote, in addition to business organizations, nonprofit organizations too can use guidance in making the spaces within their organizations LGBTI friendlier. Right? And so we want to think about how do we understand from public sector to private sector, creating measures for LGBTI workplace inclusion. And so I am wrapping up. I know that we want to leave space for questions. So why should businesses care? Why should you all care in public relations, right? LGBTQI plus, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, same-sex loving, same gender loving, gender non-conforming folks, all kinds of folks across and who are a part of what we might call diverse genders and sexualities work with you, and we share the nation. We want to do so free of violence and discrimination. Gender and sexual discrimination is harmful for any workplace for both employees and clients. Protecting employees from harm should be a #1 priority. Yeah? And engaging in social responsibility for the workplace inside and outside is necessary. And I close with diversity and inclusion equals excellence and success. And so here are some resources for you, and I open up to questions now. You've seen this image before, Keep Calm and Share the Nation. This was designed by Kaiso, and it was one of Colin Robinson's very famous quotes. And, we made shirts, we put it on placards when we were protesting. And, we've used it in several different ways that we've done advocacy, LGBTI advocacy and activism, to remind us that, we're here. We're not something that's foreign. We're here, and we want to just share this space with you. And I also want to share here this image, Caribbean Sexualities. This is a collection that I worked on with Rosamond King and Vidyaratha Kasoon. It's a beautiful collection that highlights the complexity of our region on sexualities and social justice. And that image is by Shalini Siraram, who is our very own Trinidad and Tobago artist, an amazing visual artist. And we highlight her work in this collection. And I put some resources there for you to refer to collections, as well as the portal that I referenced earlier. And if we have time, we can share the animation for Add All Three. So thank you for listening, and I hand over to Joanne, who will facilitate our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nixon. I think that was very interesting, particularly since I'm coming from also an academic background and cultural studies. The first thing that came to my mind was gender performativity with Judith Butler. I was just to summarize for those who may have missed the beginning. This is Dr. Angelique Nixon. She's a lecturer at the Institute of Gender Studies at the University of the West Indies. And we are talking about equality, gender equality in the workplace. The three key things, three terms that we must consider, Dr. Nixon said, when we are talking about gender equality is equality, equity, and justice, right? And particularly justice, and how do you address inequality? Right? Because we have to address the systemic barrier. I mean, even though that we discussed the Equal Opportunity Commission, the launch of the Equal Opportunity Commission, the criminalization of acts of same-sex adults in 2018, there is still much more work to be done with regards to equality in the workplace. I mean, for example, we have Scotiabank that just announced that, that its concerns for same-sex partners in the workplace, and that is just one organization that has made it public. But there's more work to be done within, the environmental, the milieu, the corporate as well as state milieu, that, that we need to have that equality, because at the end, Dr. Nixon said, protecting employees from harm is a number one priority. And I think that also links with the human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights in the workplace, because you have to protect the people in the workplace. So now we are going to some questions that we got from some members, from some of our viewers. We had them early because we asked people to send in questions before today. And so the first question that we have, Dr. Nixon, is diversity and inclusion a continuous process?
Well, I think that it is. It has to be, right? I mean, we have so many inequalities. It's not something that we could, I think so often that we think about the sort of spectrum, like we've reached these rights, and so then we're okay. Like that somehow, that the work doesn't continue. I think it is. I think it is a continuous process. And I think we have to have that intersectional analysis. We have to be willing to think about people's different experiences. We also have to be willing to talk about privileges and disadvantages and marginalization. We have to be able to have honest conversations about all of our different identities, right? And how we then experience the world. And so I think having a clear policy on diversity and inclusion is a start. But then, just like laws, we can have laws change and shift, and we did. We had decriminalization, but as so many of LGBT organizations and activists have long, and myself have long, we've been talking about this for a long time, is that we have to also shift and transform and engage our cultural norms, right? And values. Similarly, we can talk about it with the issue of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. We've had really clear for, over 30 years across the region in the English-speaking Caribbean, we've had very strong domestic violence laws. And yes, they continue to be improved. We just had domestic violence laws. The Domestic Violence Act was amended to include really important, needed changes just last year. And, so improvements have to happen. We have to go back and think about, oh, well, that didn't really work. Who is not included? And so, the issue of gender-based violence, we started out 2020 with alarming rates of femicides. And then we started 2020 with the same. And so we've seen, an uprising against gender-based violence and continued conversations. And so, a lot of those conversations begin with we have to transform culture and cultural norms. And so I think it's great for us to talk about and insist on diversity and inclusion, but we also have to do the work, the education, the transformation, to have the hard discussions and create spaces for us to understand each other, right? Because as Audre Lorde would say, when we fear difference, right? So if we can understand our differences, I think that creates the space for inclusion.
I agree. I think it's a question of, you can't just, it's never static. You have to keep on moving, I mean, like life, there are always, meanderings that we have to face. And that is how we are able to manage. So in this case, it applies to, diversity and inclusion as well, that you have to keep on moving, right? So the next question, what would you say is the most difficult part of implementing a diversity and inclusion program?
Sorry, the most difficult part?
Yes, of implementing a program of diversity.
Oh, implementing. So let's say you get your policy and you're like, yes, we have the policy. I think the education, and I think that's where where public relations comes in, right? And human resources would have to work well together to create the literature, to create the materials, and to create training spaces for all employees. It can't be that you just put in a policy and you don't share that with your staff. You share that with all of the people who are on your teams, and you also make it clear to the public. So there has to be public awareness, there has to be engagement on what these policies mean and what you intend to do to implement. And so that means you have to have really clear and strong training for your staff, training and this is not to target the folks who the policy might be for, but it's about having that policy where everyone understands the policy. And so you create that enabling environment that we talked about earlier for that inclusion, and ensuring that all folks are trained and understand the policy and understand how the policy works.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that is where PR comes in, because people have this perception that PR is about, just doing this superficial, and PR has a lot of making inroads in making those connections, and that is where our role should be. Okay, so the next question we have is, how would you advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion with colleagues who don't understand its importance?
Well, I think we start right here, right? We would start with these kinds of conversations. So exactly what we're doing. I think you have to begin with breaking down terms, understanding difference. Starting with, well, what do we mean when we say gender equality? What do we mean when we say gender justice? What are we talking about when we say LGBTI plus? What do we mean by inclusion and diversity? Who are we talking about? And I think it is in that framing, and that's why I tried today to present to you all, to your association, this breaking down of how we can think about these issues. And I hope that helps offer a way for us to begin the conversation. So, of course, people are going to be, people might not agree. And I think it's then important to say, the kind of the challenges then with saying, oh, well, I don't agree or believe or support. Well, it's like, well, we have to share this space. We exist, we're here, we have rights, we have human rights, and we all should have access to those rights. And I think it's also important in the context of our spaces to recognize the ways that colonization and colonial structures continue to impact us. And so we know that a whole lot of people don't feel like they have access to justice. So it's not about saying, I want more rights than you. And I think we have to debunk that right away. Like, yes, nobody's trying to fight for more rights. I'm not trying to get more rights than you. I'm just saying that we should all have access to the same rights and privileges, and to be able to live and have access to those rights and the same kinds of resources, right? And so I think that that's where it starts. It's about recognizing and saying and understanding how inequalities work and breaking that down and finding that place of common ground to have those conversations and figuring out the issue. We might realize, that we have more in common than we think. We might realize, we're like, oh, well, we are really having an issue with the fact that, we work in the same department, but we get less pay than somebody else in a different department, and we feel like we do the same amount of work. So we realize, oh, we have an issue we want to work towards, right?
Yes.
Or, maybe there's an issue with, how long the lunchtime is. I don't know. I'm just picking any issue. You can realize when you have the conversations, we might have different sexual orientations or different gender identities, but that doesn't mean that we don't also want the same things. We don't want to also be to live and work and be free of discrimination. And so I think those are the places we find common ground.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Okay, so we have one question that came in just now. It's related to gender-based violence. What part does police reform play in fighting gender-based violence?
That's a great question. I think that like what we've been talking about, right? Police require regular training on these issues and sensitization to issues related to gender-based violence, especially as it relates to LGBTI violence, which sometimes, which often different forms of gender-based violence are not always taken seriously or as seriously. And I think expanding and understanding that gender-based violence happens because of someone's sex or gender and can disproportionately, we know it disproportionately affects women, but women and girls, but it also disproportionately affects LGBTI people. So because of their sex and gender, because of sexual orientation and gender identity. So I think it's about that. Police reform, I'm not sure about what that means, but I think that I would say police education and training is crucial. I think that also there's state accountability around gender-based violence, that we continue to call women's organizations and human rights organizations continue to say that the state needs to be more accountable for funding all of the agencies that help support survivors of gender-based violence, also creating programs that get at the root causes of gender-based violence, from ensuring that there's effective training. And I'll go all the way to the beginning. We need comprehensive sex education in schools to address the issue of gender-based violence and to get at the root of it, to teach consent to young people, to understand their bodies, to be empowered around your body. And we know many studies have shown that comprehensive sex education actually prevents gender-based violence, prevents teenage pregnancy, and actually encourages young people to make more informed choices about when they have sex, and to also know how to use protection when they choose to do so. And also studies suggest that comprehensive sex education helps people have healthier relationships, right? And so we know all of these are the fuels and roots of gender-based violence. And of course, sexism and homophobia work in tandem a lot often, right? To produce forms of violence. And so we can get into that. That's a long conversation that we could just have that topic.
Yes. But before we move on, I just have a comment from one of our viewers. This is what she said. I've found that people tend to think that because Trinidad and Tobago is so diverse, that we have already ticked the D&I box. People say we have had a woman PM, we have had a woman president, we have women CEOs. LGBTI people can, for the most part, exist in peace, etc. I think that folks are mixing up tolerance with true inclusion. How would you tackle this outside of an education drive, which doesn't seem to have weight?
Oh, that really important point. Thank you so much, whoever is making that comment. Thank you. I can't see. Yeah, that's a really important point. So even thinking about the issue of tolerance, right? Like some of us say, in our activism and advocacy is like, I don't want to only be tolerated. I want to be accepted. And, in just finishing up the Sexual Culture of Justice project, we did a qualitative study of life stories of LGBTI plus working class folks living in Trinidad and Tobago. And that work and looking at the data, we ended up collecting an enormous amount of data. We asked a lot about issues related to family, acceptance, what systems of support people have, what are primary needs, what kinds of changes they would create, as well as experiences with violence. And what we found was there was all of the people who were interviewed had so many challenges with family and not being accepted, and that really determined how then they were able to go on and experience the world. And so we know that there need, so I know we're going back to that root, which is education. I do firmly believe that education is so absolutely necessary. But I also think,
Yeah.
yeah, but I also think that that can happen in different kinds of ways. And so different organizations like, for example, Silver Lining Foundation has supported something called Stronger Families, offering support to families, parents and guardians of LGBTI plus youth, especially, to help them get to that place of acceptance, for example, right? And we've also pushed really strongly for there to be protection against discrimination, because when you have working from the family to individuals to into the community, we also need the state, we need the government, and and folks who are in charge of policies to make that happen as well. And it's not about forcing inclusion, but it's about recognizing that that folks who are in a minority, who are experiencing marginalization, need that support and have to have that have to have a number of factors helping to create those spaces of acceptance. And so I think it will grow, and I think that we just have to keep working on multiple fronts.
Mhm. Okay, so the same person who asked this question has a follow-up question.
Okay.
Is there an example of a country in our region who is doing this right that we can look to as an example of where we can be if we followed their lead? So basically, they try to see if there's a
Um,
country who's doing it, and if it is, we can follow their example as a template in order to do it here.
yeah, I mean, I don't know about doing it right. I think different places have had different kinds of successes.
Mhm.
I think, we could look at, Barbados has made different kinds of strides around the language of inclusion, and we've seen that from the very top, from the Prime Minister,
Mhm.
making it very clear. So I think you have that kind of leadership that's been, really, really phenomenal. And I think that, all the way to places like Cuba, which has a lot of inclusion, and there are many different support systems and structures, even from the state. But that took a really long time, and it was a struggle. And then you have the Bahamas, where I'm from. We had decriminalization years ago,
Yeah.
decades even. We increased criminalization during the same time, the 1990, I think it was 1996 period, when Trinidad and Tobago did, along with other Commonwealth Caribbean countries, English-speaking Caribbean countries, increased penalties in the Sexual Offences Act. But then the Bahamas, a few years later, then repealed it based on privacy. But it's, that hasn't changed homophobic attitudes, and which get fueled. And I'm not saying it's only the only cause, but it does get fueled by conservative, religious perspectives, especially evangelical
Mhm.
fundamentalist perspectives that are very rigid, and really and have amped up those kinds of homophobic attitudes that we see. So
Mhm.
it's a complex question. I don't know if there's anyone who's quote unquote doing it right. I mean, in the United States, which does have laws and there's more quote unquote cultural acceptance,
Mhm.
there's extreme amounts of violence. In fact, trans people, and in particular, Black trans women, experience so much violence, and the murder rates of trans women of color are higher than ever, and in fact are higher than other places in the world. And so, I don't like to, again, oppression Olympics. I'm not Like I'm not saying that it's best or worse anywhere.
Mhm.
I think we all have our work to do, and
Yeah.
I think what my goal in my work has always been to say that our Caribbean, our region is so complex, and we've long had diverse genders and sexualities. We are not new. We didn't just show up, and we're not being influenced by people in the global north, even though we might use some of that language. We've been here a long time, we've existed a long time, and you only need to think back in your own families to think about folks, maybe we didn't use the same language, generations ago. But again, we've long been here. And so I think the landscape is complex, but I do think that we are changing, and we can do it, and we have to be a part of that change.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it is all part of the whole mindset and education, I believe. All right. So we coming to a question that is related to public relations for the practitioners in the audience. The question is, what should public relation professionals keep in mind when drafting messages to a diverse audience? Are there things they should be sensitive to when they're doing their presentation?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, I mean, if you're thinking, especially around gender identity and sexual orientation, always acknowledging that there is diversity. I think not making assumptions about people's gender identity or pronoun usage. I
Mhm.
think you should always ask. And if you're not sure, just ask, right? You can be respectful and ask. Don't make assumptions about people's sexual orientations or gender identities. And I mean that goes with so many things, right? With any of our identities, we don't want people to make assumptions about who
Yeah.
we are, right?
Yeah.
But with sexuality and with gender, sometimes it's much easier to do that, right? Because we are so entrenched in a particular gender belief system, which is
Mhm.
binary,
Mhm.
and a very heteronormative. The assumption that everybody is straight. Don't assume that everybody is straight in your workplace or who you're writing information to or who you might be communicating with. And I think that helps, right? That just not making assumptions and not being judgmental either, and keeping that open mind, so that you might be in PR or in HR or whatever, wherever you sit in your business or organization, you might be the person that someone can come to because
Yeah.
they know that you're open. And that could be really, really helpful, especially if they are experiencing something difficult in the workplace and maybe you are the first person they can come to. And so sharing that in your communications and your trainings and in the materials, even looking at your materials that you have and your policies. Look at your existing policies. Do they make assumptions? Could they be seen as discriminatory? Could you look at that policy and say, oh wow, this is not inclusive at all. It doesn't consider different matters of difference from, when we think about ability, when we think about religion, when we think about ethnicity and race, all of the ways that we want those accommodations and those considerations, we should also do it with sexual orientation and gender identity.
Great, great. So the last question I have, what would be the first approach in creating an inclusive environment in the corporate environment?
Sorry, can you say that again? I
What
missed.
would be the first approach in creating an inclusive environment in the corporate environment?
Well, I think to create an enabling environment means that you also have to communicate with your staff, with your employees, and with all of your managers, right? If your workplace and you are in a position of power to do so, you've decided that you want to take on a workplace policy that is inclusive, that includes LGBTI people,
Mhm.
and experiences and identities, you want to make sure that people are protected, then I think the first thing you might want to do is talk to your staff, right? I don't think it's a good idea to do a top down approach, me
Mhm.
personally. I mean, some folks might think that that's the best way to do it, but I think including being inclusive in your decision making and saying, we want to put this policy together. This is what we've come up with. We've done our research. We're using a model workplace policy that's designed right by an LGBTI organization in Trinidad and Tobago for Trinidad and Tobago. Let's talk about it. So I think always starting with those conversations, right? And not using, if you know someone is, LGBTI in your workplace, don't call them out and make them speak for you or, say why you need the policy. I would definitely not do that. I would say that you and your management or your team would have to be the one to lead the conversation and, show that both tolerance and acceptance, moving towards acceptance, yes? And what does it mean to create that enabling environment then? I think that's the best way to go.
Great. And I think we can conclude. Chanel, where's my producer? I don't know if she's nodding her head at me. All right. So I think after this question, I think we can wrap up now. Just to kind of summarize the conversation we had with the question and answers, I think the key words here are tolerance and acceptance. And I think another key word is education, because I think that is very important in the discussion and in unpacking, these discussions on equality and inclusion. And like you said, it's not to say that we have to do it from the top down, but just have a conversation, and hopefully that the responses that we get, if it is we have to delve into those issues, that we are able to get something more productive, that will be embracing and make the workplace a more comfortable fit for everyone, right? And based on that, I would like to say thank you so much, Dr. Nixon, for joining us today. It was very, very interesting to have this conversation about diversity and inclusion, because I think, and I speak on behalf of the executive of the Public Relations Association of Trinidad and Tobago, that it is important, particularly for us as practitioners, as to how we can guide that discussion within the workplace, and how we are able to share that information in a space that is comfortable, not necessarily to develop tensions within our colleagues or even within the other employees that we work with, but to make sure that there's some understanding, I think, at the end, because it's not about, like you said, it's about tolerance and acceptance, but not about forcing, but at least opening that gap, bridging that gap of awareness that is sorely needed within the workplace. And Dr.
Yes. Having an LGBTI sensitivity training is always a good idea, and you can call on many of us in LGBT organizations as well as at IGDS to host those for you. So get in touch with us.
Yes, and we will post all that information, post our conversation tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Nixon. And on behalf of the Public Relations Association, thank you so much for joining us this evening. So please be safe. Don't forget, sanitize, mask up, keep your distance if you decide to go outside. And if you're sheltering in place, be good. Thanks. Good night.